I'm here to talk about corporate courts, but really I'm here and the Energy Charter Treaty, but because, the world, our governments are not doing what needs to be done to tackle the climate crisis. And so why? Well, it's not because people do not know what needs to be done. It's not because we just need to sort of explain it a little bit more clearly. It's because decisions are made by the powerful corporations, fossil fuel companies, other of those in power whose interests lie in the status quo, so that the decisions that are being made are not the decisions that are actually in the interests of people and planet. It's about those power structures, and there are many different types of power structures, but one particular sort of quite specifically clearly defined power structure is the power written into what we call corporate courts, formerly known as Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS. These are these secret tribunals that can be written into trade deals that allow, as Alison and others have said, companies to sue governments outside of the national legal system. And one of the key ones, particularly with regard to climate and energy, is the Energy Charter Treaty. But I find it easier to sort of talk about what it is and why it matters by talking about the actual cases, what it does. So that's what I will do. And if I had been talking to you maybe 5 years ago about, because corporate courts are something that we've been campaigning on for some while, because they're also just fundamentally unjust, aside from the risk that they pose for climate. So yeah, 5 years ago, I would probably have talked about a range of cases, sort of maybe one to do with public services, and one to do with health, and one to do with workers' rights, and I'd have talked about one to do with climate. And the case that I know I did talk about quite often then, a fracking company called Lone Pine, which is suing the Canadian government over a moratorium on fracking, which was introduced in Quebec. And I would have talked about it because in particular to illustrate the way in which corporate courts are used to reinforce corporate power and to fight back against people's victories, because the fracking moratorium that was won in Quebec didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of 10 years or so of concerted organizing and mobilizing and campaigning, starting at very local level, bringing groups together, petitions, demonstrations, protests. At one point, there was a march all the way along the St. Lawrence River Valley in Quebec, sort of from one end to the other, with events happening all the way down the march, and a big demonstration in Montreal. And around that time, public polling showed that about 80% of the population in Montreal had concerns about fracking, because of all of this work and campaigning to raise awareness. And because of that, the Quebec government said that they would look into it. They commissioned a review. Often that kind of thing is just sort of, we will do a review and then we will do nothing. But actually, the review came back and said, yes, there is an issue. We recommend that there should be a moratorium. The Quebec government said, okay, we will act upon these recommendations. They follow all of the proper process, review, report, recommendations, legislative process, at which point the fracking company comes back and says, that's not fair. And they slap down this corporate court case. So that sense of this is something that thousands of people at various points had been involved in campaigning for, and the democratic pressure that had built around it, and you have a people's victory for something, and then you have this system that just allows the corporation to come in and slap it back down. So that's the first point that I would want to try and emphasize around corporate courts, the way that they are there almost as a means to to allow corporations to push back against democratic victories. But then I realized that there was another climate-related corporate court case, this time a UK company called Rockhopper, which is an oil company, and it is suing Italy over a ban on offshore oil drilling. And again, in a very similar story, many protests, demonstrations in that region of Italy around this, leading eventually to this ban. So there's that element in it too. But a second thing to draw out about corporate courts from this case, Rockhopper had invested, well, they say that they'd invested about 40 to 50 million in exploring this oil field as far as they had been able to get before this ban came into place. Actually, that, you know, other figures seem to suggest they hadn't even invested that much. But either way, 40 million, say, that's not what they're suing for. They are suing for 275 million because they reckon that if all of the oil that is in that field is there, if they can get it all out, if there are no accidents, if the oil price holds up, if their most optimistic scenario plays out, that is profit that they could have made. So they are suing for their expectation of profit. And that's something that corporate courts allow you to do that you couldn't do in normal legal systems. And that is one of the reasons why corporations use it in general. But this is particularly significant in terms of climate, because this is something where fossil fuel companies who have been profiting for years out of burning fossil fuels and creating the climate crisis, they're getting a second payout for being asked, or not asked, required to stop. But also this concept, I don't know if many of you have heard of stranded assets, that many of these corporations have on their books nominally assets of fossil fuel, oil fields, mines, whatever, infrastructure related to fossil fuel, all of which, according to, you know, in recommendations of the International Energy Agency, of the IPCC, UN climate scientists, need to be left in the ground. So they're nominally assets on the books, but they're stranded assets because really they should be being written off and closed down anyway. But here is a way that you could make money out of them after all. And that sense, that's something that's actually getting quite a lot of actual governments and people who would not normally necessarily agree with us, because the scale of stranded assets is massive. And if all of these corporations start suing, that, you know, the amounts could be at stake, could be in the trillions. So that's the second point, the massive payout and the amounts at stake. Third point comes with two linked cases, which include the one RWE, the one that I know you're particularly aware of. So Uniper and RWE, two energy companies, they both happen to be German energy companies, both opened coal power stations in the Netherlands in 2015 and 2016, which is way after the point when any new coal power stations should have been being opened anyway. It's not like they were not aware of the issues that they were facing in doing so. And I mean, again, you have this story around people's victory, because activists in the Netherlands were also like, this is ridiculous. And in the Netherlands as here, you'd had years of climate movement, and it felt like, you know, this is the year that the Paris Climate Agreement was signed, but the government is commissioning new coal power stations. And one of the things that a group of activists got together under the organization Agenda, and they actually took their government to the national courts and challenged them for not doing enough to meet their Paris climate commitments. And over those, took a couple of years to go through, but in the end, the Supreme Court of the Netherlands agreed with them. It was quite a landmark case, said, yes, the Dutch government needs to live up to its obligations to future generations, and it is not doing so at the minute. It needs to do more. The pressure from that case, also, you know, the ongoing organizing, mobilizing protests, demonstrations, forced the Dutch government to back down. And they introduced a law to phase out coal power. And as soon as they did so, both UNEPA and RWE started shouting very publicly that they would bring a case in corporate courts. And this is the system can be very secretive. There's no requirement to actually be at all public and transparent about what's going on. Sometimes it can be very hard to discover that a case is happening at all. So when instead companies are very loud and public and shouting about it, I feel that what they are aiming at is a chilling effect, which is something that has been documented around these corporate court cases in the past. One of those cases that I might have talked about a few years back around health was a fairly notorious case when the tobacco company Philip Morris sued Australia over plain packaging on cigarettes. And while it did so, every other country around the world held off on introducing plain packaging on cigarettes while they waited to see what happened with that case. And Philip Morris actually lost in the end on a technicality, and many countries, including the UK, promptly went ahead and introduced plain packaging. But that case took several years to go through the courts. So there was a delay in the introduction of that in many places around the world. When you translate that to the delays that we have already had in climate action and the slow pace and the foot dragging, this is yet another thing that could just cause governments to hold off for longer. And last year I read some more research around that chilling effect on the Philip Morris case, which is more worrying, which says it had a chilling effect on rich country governments for the length of time of the case, but on many countries in the global south, that chilling effect actually lasted far longer and may still be going on, because regardless of the fact that Philip Morris actually lost, those countries know themselves to be much more vulnerable. It costs millions even just to fight a case, let alone the risk that you might lose, and you might be hit with one of these massive payouts. So yes, UNEPA and RWE both threatened these cases. Initially, I think they may actually have been sort of aiming at the Dutch government and parliament in the hopes that they might back down on introducing this phase-out law. They didn't. They continue to be very public about it. The amounts also, again, are massive. UNEPA is suing for around €1 billion. RWE is suing for 1.4 billion euros. And the message that they are sending, I believe, there is no longer to the Netherlands. It is a global message to many countries around the world, which is basically saying, were you also thinking you might introduce phase-out laws? Were you also thinking you need to do more on climate action? Look what's happened to the Netherlands. Are you sure you want to face this? Are you sure that you can afford it? Would you maybe want to do less, to slow down, to think again, to not do what maybe you were planning to do? And I mean, I've been saying that for a while. Start of this year, journalists actually managed to get two government officials from the climate ministries in Denmark and the Netherlands to admit that that is literally the case. So Denmark had admitted that they had set climate targets later than the science otherwise tells them they need to, because they were being afraid of being sued. New Zealand said that they had not signed up to some of the initiatives at COP last year in Glasgow because they were afraid of being sued. So that chilling effect is very real, and that is something that I feel is one of the most serious effects of corporate courts, the fact that it can really actually block climate action. Again, just a month back, the latest report from UN climate scientists and the IPCC, that said exactly those words. It said it highlighted the risk that the system could be used by fossil fuel companies to block the transition away from fossil fuels. And I read that and I was thinking about, and then I was telling somebody a couple of days later, and then I thought, it can't have actually said block. I must have just sort of put my own words onto that. And I went back and I checked it, and no, the UN report says the risk that it can block climate action. So that's really strong language, the kind of thing that we say all of the time, written in this UN climate report. And you know, when we have these cases, then I realize, of course, these cases are coming. Of course, there are far more climate cases than there were before, because it is that same pattern, this pattern that, you know, that I just, of people's action and mobilizing and organizing, causing a change in policy, a decision, and then governments turn into corporate courts to fight back against it. And it's that pattern writ large that finally, globally, governments are beginning to take climate action. And it's too little, it's too late, it's too slow, but action is beginning to come. And as they begin to take action, the fossil fuel companies are turning to this system that helps them to fight back against it. And yeah, and since then, the cases, they have come. There's another UK company is suing Slovenia over a ban on fracking. The tar sands pipeline, the Keystone tar sands pipeline from Canada to the US, which Biden cancelled. It's one of the symbolic things that he did on his first day in office. So the owners of that tar sands pipeline are suing. When I talk about these massive amounts going up to 1.4 billion, that company, it's called TC Energy. It's as though they're like, hold my beer, see what we can do. So they are suing for 15 billion, which is just way off the scale. RWE itself, because I know you're particularly interested, RWE they're getting a payout without even bringing a case. So exactly that kind of chilling effect from the Netherlands. And you referred also to Vattenfall suing Germany a while back over nuclear phase out. So Germany is also looking at doing a coal phase out. And Germany has experience of being sued. It knows what can happen. The civil servants are very aware of it. So they want to avoid that. So they are trying to formulate the way in which they will do a phase out, and they decided that they are going to do so with a contract with the energy companies, and in that contract the energy companies will promise not to sue. But in that contract they also agreed the level of compensation that the energy companies will get. And the level of compensation is, for some inexplicable reason, 12 times higher than you would get if they followed the normal procedures for agreeing compensation within government structures. And the only reason that anybody can see for that amount to be 12 times higher is in exchange for the promise not to sue. So they didn't even have to sue, they just had to sort of waive the threat of the possibility of suing, and they've got the payout. So that, again, there are two companies involved, RWE and another German energy company called Blaylock. But yeah, so that's the cases that are coming, and the fear that there will be more of these cases if we do not get rid of this system. To maybe pause at this point, just to sort of say, go back to what is it and how does it work? Because people, yeah, but where are these cases? How does it? There is no sort of central court. It's not that there is a place that these that these tribunals are located. They come from chapters or sections within trade deals or investment deals. And those, it's under the rules of the trade deal that the tribunals happen. They can be set up and happen just about anywhere. They can just happen in a, they can book a hotel room and hold the tribunal in a hotel room. Nowadays, I believe they do them by Zoom, or at least they probably pay a lot more for a posher system. But it's not that there's a center to it. The center, insofar as it is in these trade deals and treaties. And the treaty that many of the energy companies, the fossil fuel companies, are using is the Energy Charter Treaty. Uniper, RWE, Rockhopper, Ascent Resources, which is the company that's suing Slovenia over fracking, they're all using the Energy Charter Treaty, and it's very convenient for fossil fuel companies because it is focused on the energy sector. It's also a big treaty. It's between 50 countries. It is the most used treaty by energy companies and fossil fuel companies. And some academics that we work with just recently released some figures around the level of risk that countries face. And again, the Energy Charter Treaty is the largest source of risk. So if we could take out the Energy Charter Treaty, that would, it wouldn't completely put an end to this system, but it would punch a massive hole in the middle of it, and it would remove a lot of the risk. That's explaining a bit of the mechanics of it. But I realize also people are often like, yes, but why? Why did we ever create such a system in the first place that gives this tool to fossil fuel companies for them to be able to fight back against people's victories? Who agreed to this? Who created it? And it says, well, the people who created it were the fossil fuel companies in the first place. Back in the 1950s and 60s, at that point, the fossil fuel companies were worried about the independence struggles of the many former colonies around the world. And many of those countries are saying, these really dangerous things like we control our own destinies now, our own future, our own resources. And the fossil fuel companies in particular are going, hang on, what do you mean you control your own resources? We own your resources. We've owned them ever since we invaded your country and took control of it. Just because you're independent, what do you mean you think you now control your own resources? And a couple of, typically it's always a couple of guys, a banker called Herman Abs and the lawyer for Royal Dutch Shell, a guy called Hartley Shawcross, they got together and they wrote the first draft of the corporate code system. They did it together with a wider range of fossil fuel companies and other big businesses, and then they shopped it around governments. And they didn't quite get what they wanted. They had wanted one big treaty that would cover everybody, but instead they got a lot of governments to start adopting this, to start putting this into lots of different treaties. And that's where the origins of this system come from. So it was written by the fossil fuel companies to protect themselves from the democratic threat of the post-colonial struggles. And it's now being used by the fossil fuel companies to protect themselves from the democratic threat of the struggle for climate justice. And to me, that just epitomizes that this is just a completely rotten system to the core, and we need to get rid of it. And good news, we can. In the past 10, 15 years, increasingly countries have been taking steps to move away, to cancel their treaties that have the corporate court system in it, to remove it from treaties. So countries like India, South Africa, Brazil has always refused to sign one of these, Tanzania, New Zealand, Bolivia, even now the US, possibly not disconnected from being sued. They're beginning to take steps to get rid of the system. And with the Energy Charter Treaty, we also see the same. So increasingly, there is a lot of doubt and skepticism from particularly European countries who are members of the Energy Charter Treaty. Europe forms the largest core of it. It's largely European countries, Central Asian countries, and a few Middle Eastern countries. And many of the European countries have, about 7 or 8 years ago, they started saying that it needed to be reformed. 5 years ago, they said it needs to be reformed to be in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. In the last couple of years, they've been saying, well, we've been trying to reform it and we're not getting anywhere. So we probably should leave. Actually, Italy already has. Again, Rockhopper sued them. They would not admit why, but Rockhopper sued and then they left. So we are approaching this crunch moment in June. that's the point at which many of these European countries have kind of semi-imposed a deadline saying, look, we've been trying to reform this for the last 5 years. We are going to decide whether that reform has changed anything. The reform proposals at the minute would not change anything. They say, we will exclude fossil fuel companies from this in 10, 12, 15, maybe even longer years. And it's like, that's ridiculous. That is the point when you are supposed to have phased out all of these things anyway. Well, really, you need to phase it out now. I mean, that is the, you know, the most, some of their commitments are to phase things out in 10, 15 years. So by then they should have phased them out. So those companies will still be able to sue at the point at which they start being phased out. The science tells them they need to phase out now. We need to cancel all new fossil fuel projects. Nothing that is in the pipeline should be able to go ahead. So if we are to do what actually needs to be done, then phasing this out in 15 years' time is not going to make any difference. So the pressure is on at the end of this month, on the 24th of June, for countries to say that they are withdrawing from the Energy Charter Treaty. And countries, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, France, Poland, Slovenia, Slovakia, Cyprus, Greece, all of these countries have said that they are considering withdrawing. So this is something where there is movement, where it is possible. And if we could get a mass of countries to leave the Energy Charter Treaty, then probably the whole thing would collapse. And that would in turn put this big hole in the system. So I see hope. I see the possibility of actually beginning to get change. And that if we could take out the Energy Charter Treaty, if we could fundamentally weaken the corporate court system, that takes out one of the key power structures that fossil fuel companies use to tip those decisions in their favor. And it would strengthen the ability of all of the campaigning and the organizing and the mobilizing that we do to be able to have its own victories. So that's why we are campaigning on to get rid of corporate courts. And I'll